Okay. Of course, over the weekend, I got my sling off. I can move my arm kind of normally. The Giants won the World Series, and I got a horrendous head cold. So I turned the volume up in hopes that you'll be able to hear me even with my whatever, cold. All right. I wanted to start with a little bit more on Marx because I think this is important and I never got time to say it last week. So remember with Weber, I kept drawing this diagram on the board showing society and the many different kinds of cleavages there could be, and they pulled people in all different directions. Their class interests, their status interests, their party interests, and even their class interests could take multiple forms. You could be a worker, but also the member of a particular union, and that union might not have solidarity with all other workers, might be just protecting the jobs of certain skilled workers. So for Weber, the world of group formation looks like this. For Marx, Marx argues that in the historical long run, the bases on which these different cleavages can form shift in a particular direction. So you might think of Marx as taking Weber's society, shaped like an egg, but I can't help that, and kind of the historical conflicts will shake it and shake it. Think like the agitator in a washing machine or maybe a dryer, until all those different lines of division align, right? And it doesn't happen at any given moment. It doesn't happen right now. Marx might agree that right now the world kind of looks like this. Lots of different groups, lots of different interests. But Marx's theory is a theory of historical change, of historical process. And Marx thought that especially under capitalism, all the different kinds of class and status and interest cleavages were going to collapse, partly for the reasons we talked about last time. Your ethnic group, your nation, your language, your this, were all going to be obliterated by the inexorable growth of the market, which would obliterate all those particular differences between people. And pretty soon, everything, not pretty soon, eventually, things would look more like this, with a huge, potentially unified proletariat and a tiny, tiny bourgeoisie. And then a very powerful bourgeoisie that controlled virtually all the means of production. But in fact, since the workers were running the means of production, they were the true source of social labor, they would be able to push off that class, take control, and that would be that. So that leads me to one other really important point. And this does not come up in what you read. But Marx called himself a historical materialism. Marx and Engels, that's what they called their theory. Sometimes they called it scientific materialism. Sometimes they called it historical determinism. Sometimes they called it historical materialism. So lots of different words for it, but all of them sound terrible to American ears. And in fact, the people who took up the banner of Marxism often took these words all too seriously and were willing to make utterly inhumane political choices in the name of this theory. So I don't kid myself, and I wouldn't kid you about this. And I just read a little summary of a new biography of Mao Zedong. And you know, some of his thinking was just incredibly strongly shaped, not by the pragmatics of the Chinese situation, but by his understanding of Marx. And some of his most brutal policies came out of his Marxist, no, not all of them, but some of them really came directly out of his reading of Marx. Nonetheless, I think that the view of Marx as a historical determinist is often misunderstood. It's what Marx meant is misunderstood. And so I just want to point to the role of historical. Marx and Engels used a phrase, material factors are determinative, that is, they're the important causal factors, in the last instance. In the last instance. Now, that could mean, and people have often interpreted it this way, that what's really important is material conditions and everything else is just fluff. And if you just, you know, people say, I believe in this ideal, or I'm loyal to my ethnic group, or I am committed to the proletariat even though I was born rich, or whatever. But if you really penetrated down to the bottom, you'd find out it was about their material interests. And that's one way of interpreting this, but I actually think it's wrong. Not just that it's unappetizing, but I actually think it's a misreading of what they were doing. And in fact, I think what Marx means by in the last instance is something historical, which is in the historical long run, these conflicts will emerge. It's not a matter of what people want. It's what he understood to be the way capitalism worked. And in that sense, the material conditions, so to speak, will become determinative, because as capitalists are forced to consolidate their businesses in larger and larger units, as they're forced to drive down the wages of their workers, as competition drives them to certain strategies where they expand their world markets, as the source of profits from those markets dry up and they have nowhere to look for profit but squeezing workers more and more, those conflicts will heat up because objectively they have to, the people being squeezed and the people doing the squeezing. And as that happens historically, the material conflicts between them will become, in some sense, the only reality. And so one thing I would just ask you to remember is that we, and especially you, live in a world where we have an enormous number of choices. We are really remarkably free. And despite this picture I gave you of, oh my God, if you don't get a job when you graduate, you could starve, that's true. But you will actually get a job. And the world you live in gives you a huge number of choices, political choices, consumer choices, choices about your family structure, choices about what to think and how to lead your life. Don't waste your life drinking and partying. Enjoy things that are really worthy of you. But okay, you got lots and lots of choices, huge number. But if you were in a revolutionary situation, if you were in a situation where one class, ethnic group, whatever, was mobilizing, think about Iraq maybe is a good way to think about it. And you're a very open person and you have friends who are Sunni and friends who are Shia and friends who are Christian, there's a little Christian minority there, and you've never thought of people in terms of their ethnicity or their religious affiliation. You like everyone. But a war between Shia and Sunni starts to heat up so that Sunni are driven out of Shia neighborhoods, Shia are driven out of Sunni neighborhoods, and pretty soon there is no, objectively, there is no neutral place where you can say, oh, I like everybody. I'm sympathetic to everybody. I don't judge my friends based on their group. Someone will ask you your name on a bus, and if your name is Al something, I don't actually know what the names are, but if it's the wrong name, you'll be killed. And if it's the right name, you'll be expected to join the side that's raided the bus. And you always have the option of saying, I won't tell you my name because I identify with all the people. You could do that. So you still always have a choice. But that choice will get you killed. And that many people made such choices during the Holocaust and so forth. They just would not answer the question, which side are you on? But at these historical moments, Marx sees that history has changed. It's not that you've changed. History has changed under you, and it has constrained the choices available until in the last instance, your choices are determined, Marx believed, by the material conditions of history. Okay? That's really what he's saying. Now, I have reasons, and I'll talk about them later, for believing that's not necessarily true. Many of you have pointed out that Marx's theory might be right, but the conflicts under capitalism might not be the last conflicts, as Marx thought. There might be new forms of production and new conflicts ever emerging, which would mean we would never get to this point of complete, everything is consolidated into one set of conflicts. But I just want you to understand that Marx is making a very powerful argument about how history determines us. And in fact, not just at this moment, those of you whose parents or grandparents lived through the Cultural Revolution, that was a situation where there were very few choices, and which side maneuvering so that you could either stay under the radar, not be noticed, or be on one side or the other. That was, I mean, there were no other, it just, these periods of social turmoil, that's why I'm no fan of revolutions, they offer choices, all of them bad. So that, just remembering the sense in which Marx is a determinist. He is a determinist, but he is a historical determinist. Okay, now, moving to today's lecture. Sorry to do these abrupt turnabouts. Okay, and sorry to have such a busy, messy slide. All right, but what I want to talk about is really the big picture again. So if you remember back, and I'm sure all of you hated it, to the Blau and Duncan lectures and the correlation matrix and the path diagram, that was about the degree to which parents' economic and occupational status, their success, if you want to call it that, influences their children. And this is, again, the field of stratification and inequality. The reading you're doing this week is about what I would call structural approaches to inequality. So when you do the reading, I want you to think about how the authors are arguing that there are structural circumstances that are largely actually outside the perception of individuals. So when you do the reading, think about whether the people who are being influenced by these structural factors would have any way of realizing that that was really what was shaping them. Is there any likelihood that they could see it from where they are? And I would argue mostly not, but that would be a very interesting thing to discuss in section. Okay, I want to put that issue of the structural determination of inequality in a much, I can raise one arm really well and this one I can't, but a much bigger, I'm doing like YMCA. No, I'm not doing that. Okay, so what is the big way to think about inequality? And one way to think about it is that the overall pattern of inequality in societies, and this is actually derives from an old sort of funky tradition in sociology called something like social ecology or something like that. There's a very smart sociologist named Gerhard Lenski, Lenski, and he wrote a book, I think called Social Evolution. It was a textbook, and it was very, very influential and very smart. So what did he argue? He argued that in the long historical sweep, and he was talking from, you know, the origin of humankind basically through the ancient world up until modern times, the overall patterns of inequality were shaped by what it is that dominant groups could monopolize and what they could transmit to their offspring. So the big question I'm arguing is, what is it that dominant groups can monopolize, and what is it that they can transmit to their offspring? And I think Lenski argues, and to me it's persuasive, that in societies where there's nothing much material that lasts, you have quite egalitarian social systems because there's really nothing you can hold on to that makes you dominant over other people. These are places where, in the tropics often, where food rots, so you can't actually hold on to your supply of anything for very long, and where there really aren't technologies that allow you to monopolize things like machinery, and in fact where even the things you might have like animals, let's say you keep pigs. I'm thinking of a New Guinea society about which I saw a great anthropological film, if you ever get to see it, Oka's Big Mocha, one of the great, really great films. You could probably find it on the web. Your pigs might die of some disease before you could eat them all, so trying to collect more and more and more of them never makes sense. And in fact, what people in those societies tend to do, and this is still true in many African societies, this is what we see on the ground in places like Malawi, is they convert whatever material wealth they have into influence over other people. So it's not important to have a lot of material stuff. If you have a lot of material stuff, you loan it or give it away. So if you have cattle, as many of these groups do, instead of becoming the richest guy and keeping all the cattle for yourself, what you want to do is loan your cattle out to relatives or other dependents who will then owe you cattle, because you're much better off not owning the cattle, but owning a claim on somebody else's cattle, because then if they all die, they still owe you. Whereas if you owned, 40 cattle, which that's how they say it. I'm not sure what the plural should be, but that's how you would say it in Botswana or Malawi. So if you own 40 cattle, they might all die. If you have loaned 6 cattle to this nephew so he could marry, and 4 cattle to this one, and 8 cattle to that one, then you have a lot of obligations and you're an important person. And so these groups tend to convert whatever material wealth there is, even if it's very minimal, into connections to other people. So you bring back meat from a hunt, and you owe it. You give it to your wife's kin. So the first thing you do with anything you have is there's a set of obligations about who you have to share it with. You come back with grain. You have grain in a year when everybody else is hungry. You give most of it away. So in some sense, you can't really accumulate, and you don't tend to get stable class patterns. And it's very difficult for people to monopolize advantage from generation to generation. So these societies actually have very high mobility, because it is difficult for whoever happens to be lucky or fortunate or wealthy or influential in one generation to hold on to something that she or he can monopolize to transmit to the next generation. The huge break in human history is the development of stable agriculture. And in many places, not everywhere, so again, not in these really tropical places, but in many places, agriculture created kinds of assets that could last from one year to the next. Now here I'm going to go way beyond anything Lenski says, and it's probably wrong. I just want you to know, but I believe it. Okay, so it always mystified me that in China and Japan, people liked white rice, and I was sort of a hippie young person. I'm not a hippie old person, but anyway, I was then, and I ate brown rice, and I thought it was healthier and tastier and better, and I just couldn't figure out why it was considered prestigious to eat white rice. Why would that be, given that brown rice is so much healthier? And then I left my brown rice out for a couple months, and of course it went rancid, which it does without, you have to refrigerate it if you have it, unless you eat a lot of it pretty quickly, and you can't store it because it will rot. It has all the oils and the this and that. And then I realized, aha, in a white rice culture, you can actually store massive amounts of grain. You can do it with maize, the hard corn, and with rice, and probably wheat as well, although I don't know as much about wheat. And then one person can monopolize a lot of wealth and a lot of wealth-producing assets. And here you get this inequality emerging again between those who have enough grain that when it comes time to plant in the succeeding year, they have plenty of seed corn or plenty of seeds for new rice, and the people who are so poor they constantly have to borrow and impoverish themselves and subordinate themselves. You also get these kinds of class societies, I think, where there are massive, public works, like in ancient Egypt, when controlling the flow of the Nile was the secret to agricultural productivity. So you have one person kind of dominates, or not one person, but one group dominates a whole bunch of slaves who have to be used to build up whatever dams and sluices and things that create irrigation, things like that. But the point is still that you can think in very material terms about what is it that dominant groups can monopolize, and what kind of advantage does that give them in transmitting their privileges to the next generation, versus in what kinds of situations are the things that they try to monopolize not very stable. And I've used the example of Joseph in Egypt before, and I won't go into it again, but just to remind you, for those of you who do know the Old Testament, the story of Joseph accumulating the 7 years' worth of grain and then essentially making Pharaoh the owner of all the land and all the animals in Egypt because he was the only one with grain and everyone else was starving. So that's a huge, and again, as an imagined kind of world, it really suggests how people understood the possibility of inequality, right? That's, yeah. Okay, now then, I want to raise a really important set of questions about how monopolies of privilege work in societies like ours, in modern societies, in our own era. But I want to think about it in the same way, which is not whether it's fair or not. I'm going to leave that completely aside and try to think analytically about this in just cold, hard, theoretical, explanatory terms. What is it that groups can monopolize in modern societies? And how effectively, therefore, can they transmit their privilege? Can privileged groups transmit their privilege to their children? And I take it for granted that throughout most of human history, that has been a dominant goal. Families have wanted to consolidate as much security or advantage for their own family members. Now, how that family is defined, of course, varies enormously, from thinking of your family and its dominance as being a matter of your whole clan of, maybe a couple of hundred people, versus in medieval Europe, it might have been an interconnected family of 15 or 20 people, a lineage group, to modern societies with our nuclear type families. It might be just two parents and their one very carefully cultivated child. So that's true. But you can think of everything that Annette Leroux described in Unequal Childhoods, and everything you are reading about poor black young men in poor neighborhoods in Boston this week, as being about parents' attempts to give their children the best opportunities they can and the constraints on that ability. That's really what the study of mobility is about. That, at its heart, that's what it's about. And so I'm trying today to raise the question of, but what can you monopolize? What can you hold on to? Now, Weber emphasized status group competition, and he really thought that one way privileged groups held on to their privilege was by creating whole societies in which the definition of who deserved to be in the elite who deserve privilege, who deserve to run the banks, who deserve to, you know, be in the nobility, who deserve to be a knight, was defined through the status attributes. And so I pointed out that high status groups looked for symbolic things they could monopolize, things that appeared to create a kind of superiority. And I don't want to neglect the fact that very often these status groups that are arguing for their own superiority in fact create some of the most beautiful cultural objects ever known to humankind, and they do it across many, many civilizations. So, you know, if you've ever seen the Tutankhamun gold objects or the, you know, heads of Nefertiti, they occasionally travel so you can see them, but I actually was in Germany and I saw them in the Antikische Museum or whatever it's called. And I mean, some German ripped them off in the 19th century from Egypt, and wow, somebody named Becker or something like that. And I'm telling you, they're gorgeous. Or you could go to the Islamic art exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum, which will be there forever. It's a new installation, it's completely unbelievably gorgeous. And you see what caliphs and various emperors and so forth over the centuries built and had designed for them in this gorgeous porcelain and just amazing stuff. And you could go to Italy and see the gorgeous art in Italy and stuff. So this is not something that just one civilization does. Super elites everywhere have partly tried to reinforce their status by monopolizing sources of religious meaning, sources of beauty, sources of moral truth, sources of prestige. So everything from good manners to musical skill, the ability to play the samisen or whatever these difficult to master skills are. In China, the ability to do great calligraphy and to know ancient texts, just highly variable. But much of it focuses on how effectively groups can monopolize something that they can transmit to their children that other people have difficulty getting access to. Now, in our own society, and here I'm moving to more or less us, Pierre Bourdieu, and I actually took French in high school, so I can sort of pronounce it correctly. And it's good, since you're going to have to know this if you were in the social sciences. You repeat after me. You don't actually have to repeat after, but in your head, Bourdieu. So many of you, I know, it doesn't look like how it's spelled, but Bourdieu. Well, I have this really smart graduate student who wrote great stuff. He's really successful and everything, but he could never master this word, and he says, Bourdieu. Bourdieu says this, and I thought, you know, it's just cultural capital. It's going to be really hard for him on the job market because he sounds like what he is, which is a working class white guy. And, you know, so he calls this person Bourdieu. So you try, sound like an upper class or pretentious or whatever, sociologist. No, just somebody who knows what's what. You know Max Weber is not Weber, it's Weber. And you know that Pierre Bourdieu is Bourdieu. Okay? Weird, but that's it. The word for, I don't know what bour means, but Dieu is God in French, so Bourdieu. And he's kind of a theory god, actually. I'm not in his religion, but still, that's, yeah. Okay, but what I want to raise, a lot of people have argued that in modern societies, what parents primarily can transmit to their children is the set of prestigious characteristics that Bourdieu broadly calls cultural capital. And that is things like taste in music, knowing something about art, these days almost certainly knowing something about food, because food has become a lot more what people talk about. Maybe it's only in California, how depressing. But anyway, a lot about food. So having delicate taste buds, that probably always mattered, that could differentiate one flavor from another and recognize exquisite cooking when you saw it. Although these things always have, you know, people who, I don't know, fly East Coast fried clams to California and so forth. It can be anything, but anyway, cultural capital. But the most important form of cultural capital is the form that shows up as educational skills. And that's what that path diagram showed, that parental advantage, to the degree that parents can transmit advantage to their children, they do it primarily, not exclusively, but primarily by making sure their kids get an education. So all their attempt to advantage their children, to protect their children, to protect their children's status, goes into cultural capital. And that also has been, in the way we've thought about it, enormously egalitarianizing, right? Because it is true, and Mike Hout, who's one of the great stratification, sociologists of stratification in the world, on the planet, has shown, as other people have, that if parents can get their kids a four-year college degree, family background has remarkably little effect on life success after that. So those of you who come from poor families and those of you who come from rich families, you get that BA, and basically what your family was like will have almost no influence on your future life chances. So education is a huge, huge, huge factor. And as we experience it, many parts of education are kind of egalitarian. That is, you take the SATs, you do well. If you're poor and you do well, if you're rich and you do well, you'll get into a good college, and even if your parents can't pay, there might be a scholarship. And so clearly it's easier if you're from a well-to-do family. But what Bourdieu pointed out is that many of the skills that schools really can't teach you are very important in doing well in school. So in fact, judging people by their educational success and their cultural capital builds a kind of invisible unfairness into the stratification system, because it looks as though everyone sat in the same classrooms, had the same teachers, got the same kind of education, except some of them did really well because they were naturally gifted, smart, hardworking, talented, you name it. And others somehow just didn't take hold. They didn't work hard enough. They played and they didn't do homework and so forth. Well, Bourdieu has argued that, in fact, many of the skills that you need in school aren't taught in school. And those are the ones where family background really matters. And that might be everything from the really obvious, like whether your parents make quiet time in the evening to do homework with you because they come home from work reasonably refreshed. They've paid someone to clean the house, and they don't have to worry about where their next meal is coming from. And they grew up believing that nothing matters more than school. And those parents manage to find the 2 hours of quiet time that you need and turn off the TV and so forth. And other parents, pressed for time, not that good in school themselves when they were young, don't do this. So that's one kind of difference. But Bourdieu was looking at deeper differences that have partly to do with self-confidence and a sense of being entitled. And again, this is what Annette Leroux was pointing to, that having parents who have themselves the experience that they matter, that they have the resources and the education to get what they want, model for their kids and show their kids how to get what they want. So I can't remember, my daughter went to private school, I will acknowledge, and there was some point at which they had a, oh my God, I'm not going to remember it, something pit. There was some game you played with a ball that you kicked the ball around, a gaga pit, Gaga? Okay, a Gaga pit. And it was, I don't remember if it was too violent and people were kicking the ball too hard or if it wasn't open enough minutes a day during recess or whatever. But she was really outraged. It was something about the Gaga pit was wrong. And she went to the principal of the school and complained. And she did not get thrown out of the office. She did not get thrown out of school on her ear. The principal of that school with all these upper middle class kids said, thank you for coming to tell me about this. Oh, this is so important. And they got whatever it was she was worried about the Gaga pit fixed. Well, that is a class-based experience of your own importance in the world. And we didn't tell her to do it. But we had obviously raised her, and the school had encouraged the kids to feel that it was their school and they had claims. And so, you know, these are the kinds of things he's really talking about. And he's saying that these are tremendously important ways of transmitting advantage. And that in some ways they are easier to monopolize than other kinds of assets. So that's what I want to think about for a minute here, is the difference between cultural capital as a mode of transmitting advantage and other kinds of capital as a mode of transmitting advantage. And so, if what you oh, I forgot the other really important part, but I have to say this first, of cultural capital, which is, of course, grammar, vocabulary, and basic language skills. And those, if you hear educated parents who pronounce every word correctly and have huge vocabularies, you are more likely to pronounce every word correctly and have a huge vocabulary. And if you have parents with very limited language skills, you have to learn much more of that in school. And so, unless you are a fanatical reader, which you should be, and the less advantaged family you come from, the more good it will do you to read. And it turns out for passing exams and things, by the way, reading Victorian novels is actually the best, because they use these kind of slightly obscure words that are the ones that differentiate the 98th percentile from the 99th from the 100th. Words like unctuous, which means oily. Kind of somebody with an unctuous style is kind of greasy. But the point is, no normal human being uses such a word in everyday speech, but Dickens uses such a word all the time. And so you just read a lot of Dickens, and both boys and girls can enjoy Dickens. Okay, that's my advice to you for the day. Now, what's the difference between cultural capital and economic capital as a form of transmitting advantage? Now, you would think that economic capital is really better. That is, if you had a world in which we're rapidly moving toward, mega wealthy people leave all their money to their kids and their kids are mega wealthy, that would be a lot better than cultural capital, which is still an uncertain thing. That is, you can give your kids many advantages and you can have a great vocabulary, and as I have learned, your kids can still come back and say, me and Jane want to go to the store, and you say, what? You say, Jane and I want to go to the store. And then your kid says, okay, and he gave it to Jane and I. And you say, no, he gave it to Jane and me. How long, you know, and so that, and I'm sure that's true of many of you. So cultural capital transmission is not 100%, it's whatever it is. I'm not exactly sure, but 80%, 70%. And some of these things become less important. But you'd think that transmitting just plain old raw wealth is better from the point of view of the privileged, more sure thing. But actually, there are a lot of problems with material wealth. One of them is that you have to divide it up. So I'm going to forget about the mega billionaires for a minute. But if you are a privileged person, sort of at the level of a nice, well-to-do attorney or physician or something, and you've got a big house in the suburbs and 2 nice cars and a swimming pool and 3 kids, and you, the privileged person, are, let's say, 55, That'd be about the right age, and your kids are in their, whatever, 20s, somewhere in there. Okay, so you had enough money to pay for college for all of them, and that's partly transmitting your wealth to them. But then when they want to start out in life, what could you give them that would guarantee success in life if you were just transmitting your material capital to them? Well, one thing is you might actually have enough to set all three up in life quite nicely if you didn't need any wealth for yourself. But the problem with material wealth is that if you give it away to somebody else, you don't have it anymore. And that's a huge problem, huge. So in fact, in societies where transmission of privilege is largely material, the oldest son is waiting around potentially almost forever for his parents to die off so he can take over the estate or the business or the whatever. So actually, there's a problem, which is that material wealth as a mode of transmission has its limits. It's zero sum, if you want to use that term, means if one person gets more, somebody else has to get less. So it turns out that in English history and American history, there are lots of examples of children making contracts with their parents to say, let me move into the cottage and take over the farm so I can get married, so I can support a family, and you go off and live in the little shack, basically, or smaller cottage, and I promise in this contract to give you a certain number of bushels of wheat and a certain amount of vegetables or whatever every year, so you'll be all right. But the parents, they're reluctant. They got it's difficult. And obviously, what you give to one child is not available to go to another child. So there is potentially enormous conflict between siblings if you rely on material capital. Now, this is somewhat less obvious a problem if you have very small families. But one of the fascinating things about the American situation is that during the colonial period, Americans were much healthier than the British had been, and it's mainly because they weren't concentrated in big cities. So out on the prairie, they weren't on the prairie, but anyway, out in the Wild West, which at that time was Kentucky or Ohio or maybe just western New York State, they could have enough land, they could grow enough crops. Anyway, people tended to have more than 2 surviving children. In fact, they had about 4 surviving children. Well, if you're transmitting your farm to your children, and that's going to be their source of livelihood, and you have to divide it in half in every generation, it is not going to support them, right? So even if you had a substantial farm and you're one of the wealthier farmers, if what you do is leave your estate to your children, one way or another, and we did not have primogeniture, we did not have this thing where the oldest son gets everything and everyone else has to fend for herself or himself. So you really did have a situation of increasing anxiety about wealth and success in life and fear of losing status. It was a pervasive problem because people had too many children and they were relying on material wealth to transmit privilege. So, what is the amazing feature of cultural capital? You, on the whole, can give it away without losing it. It's amazing. So if you yourself are educated and love reading and have a great vocabulary and teach your kids good manners and teach your kids discipline and hard work, you don't have a less good vocabulary, a less good mastery of grammar, less good manners, less good discipline and hard work. Now, of course, there are limitations of time, and I think in the current era where highly advantaged people work very, very long days. So they're actually at their offices, 10 and 12 and 14 hours a day. Then actually you might get some compromise in the ability of parents. There's still a trade-off, in other words, between the parents maximizing if you have a fancy lawyer, both parents are fancy lawyers, and they spend amazing amounts of time out of the house. They have a lot more money, but they don't have enough time to really transmit. They hire nannies, and there could be compromises. But still, cultural capital is weird in the sense that you can transmit it without losing it. It really isn't like capital in that sense, because it's a sort of immaterial thing. And on the whole, there's no conflict between your children either. Now, that's not 100% true. The vocabulary and test scores and stuff of children are slightly lower if they have more, on average, if they have more siblings. And that probably is that the child listens to more of the vocabulary of a 12-year-old when she is 5 than to the vocabulary of a 30-year-old when she is 5. So that probably slightly reduces the child's grasp of important elements of cultural capital. On the other hand, we have to bet that Mitt Romney's 5 boys are all well-spoken and well-behaved. No, and that, Bobby Kennedy's 12 kids, were presumably had lots of cultural capital also. So on the whole, the amazing feature of cultural capital is that it is and it doesn't get sick. That's the wild thing. You can leave your kid a lot of money, and if your kid is a terrible business person, she or he could lose it all. Whereas cultural capital is really hard to lose. Once you have it, you are good to go. And in fact, our society defines things that way. So it's not just that probably at any moment you could go and pass some skill test at a high level. If you had those skills when you were in high school, you probably still have them. But we define someone who got a BA as having a BA. And we don't come back and retest you 5 years later and 10 years later to see if you still have it. Right? That is a complete socially defined reality, that a person with a BA is sanctified by having a BA, and the people who don't have it, don't have it. So cultural capital can't be lost. It can't be ruined. It can't be poorly invested. It just doesn't go away. And there's this wonderful study done many years ago where a guy named John Kelly compared mobility in the US to a group in Uganda which based status completely on cattle inheritance. So the Toro of Uganda, apparently, that was the way inequality was transmitted. And he showed that inequality was much less efficiently transmitted in Uganda, where inheritance was the dominant mode, than in the US, where open educational systems were the dominant mode, because the cattle in Uganda kept dying of various diseases. Some people couldn't breed them effectively. They would get the Rinder pest, which was, I guess, a cattle disease. And so, in a weird way, while educational advantage and associated ideas of cultural capital are, and we'll see this next time, kind of an inefficient way to transmit privilege, thank goodness. And the diversity of faces and backgrounds I know are out here suggests that that's true. In many, many ways, it has advantages over all other modes of status transmission, except in one way, and this I love, which is once your parents have given you cultural capital, they also can't take it back. And so they actually can't control you in the way that earlier generations of parents could do. I have a friend who rebelled against her parents. She had been admitted to Stanford. She went there for 1 year. She visited the Berkeley campus and she said, oh my God. She transferred to Berkeley. Her well-to-do, high-status physician parents disowned her, crazy, insane, just let's leave it there, disowned her, never gave her another nickel as long as she lived, but they had already given her everything she needed to be independent of them. So that is weird. So I give you all those different ways in which